Hi knitters, I'm Sonica, a knitter with 15 years of knitting experience. I find that when I'm teaching someone to knit, there are so many little tips and tricks to make the knitting experience easier and more enjoyable, and sometimes those really aren't best explained in words. So this video is a companion to my Maple Ridge hat pattern, which you can find in my Ravelry and Etsy shops. You can find the links below. The Maple Ridge hat is a fun texture that is actually really easy to accomplish. In this video, I'm going to give you tips on how to read your knitting so you will always know where you are in your pattern, even if you have to set it down and now you don't remember where you are. When I say read your knitting, I mean how you can look at your previous stitches and rows to know where you are and what stitch you need to do next. Reading your knitting will help you so much. When I first started knitting, if I lost my place, I would often need to rip back to the beginning of the row or several rows back so I would know where I was. As I learned how to read my knitting, I have had to do this less and less. All right, let's get started with a slip knot. I want to show you how I make mine. I make a loop and then reach through that loop to grab the tail and pull. This pattern calls for a long tail cast on, and if you're not familiar with that, I have a video for it on my YouTube channel. Really, you could use any cast on that you'd like, but I find that the long tail cast on is nice and smooth and really stretchy. Just make sure when you get to the end that you've lined up all of your stitches so that your hat is not twisted as you begin your ribbing. And after 15 years, I still make mistakes like this. Have you ever grabbed the tail of your yarn instead of the long strand of your yarn to knit with? Well, here's some tips on how to take that back. You notice when I pull on the stitch, it opens up a little hole underneath the V. If you can find that little spot and that's where you put your needle, then you can slide that new stitch you made back off. You could tear this out and start again, but I found that if you're careful, you can get all those stitches unknit and back onto your left-hand needle. The hat starts with a 2x2 rib, which is a repeat of 2 knit stitches and 2 purl stitches. This creates a very stretchy brim that fits well. Here's how to read where you are in 2x2 rib. The great thing about a 2x2 rib is the stitches stack upon one another in columns, so if the stitch below the one you are making is a knit stitch, then you will always be making a knit stitch on top of it, and the same for purls. I like to think of the knit stitches looking like little V-neck shapes and the purls looking like turtlenecks. See it? This stitch is wearing a V-neck and this one is wearing a little turtleneck. Silly, I know, but I teach elementary school and I've learned that silly sticks. So here's your silly visual that will stick in your head. When you come to your next stitch, look to see if the one below is a V, a knit stitch, or a turtleneck, a purl stitch. You are going to match whatever you see. Isn't that handy? Now if you put down your knitting to check your Instagram or see what the cat's knocked over in the next room, you will know where to start back up when you return. The body of the hat is so fun, and you can read your stitches for this pattern too. Every odd row is a plain knit row, and the even rows alternate between 2 different stitch counts of the same pattern. Row 1 is a plain knit row, which sets you up with a clean line of stitches to begin your pattern. The next row adds the purl bumps. Then a plain knit row followed by a pattern row with the purls in a different spot. So, how can you tell what row you're on? Read your knitting. First, look to see if you just finished a plain knitting row or a purl bump row. As you look along the left-hand needle, is it a smooth row of V-shapes or are there bumps touching the needle? If it is a smooth row of V's, then you just finished a plain knitting row. If you see bumps or turtlenecks touching the needle, you just finished a pattern row and are ready to do a plain knit row. If you see bumps, or the little turtlenecks, touching the needle, you just finished a pattern row and are ready to do a plain knit row. It looks like this. So now you know whether you are knitting a plain or patterned row. But if it's a patterned row, which one? Row 2 starts with a purl. So look at that first stitch and follow it down. Does it have a purl right away, or is it 4 rows down? If it is close, then you did that row most recently and you are ready for row 4. If the purl bump is a ways down, 4 rows, then it's time for row 2 again. I like to have one of these easy to read patterns going at all times because they are great for knitting with friends or watching a movie. If I get distracted, it's easy for me to tell where I left off. When you've knit to the measurement in the pattern, it's time for the crown decreases. Now, when I first started knitting about 15 years ago, I had made about 10 hats before I realized that even decreases would make this nice little swirl at the top of the hat. I am a firm believer in using lots of stitch markers to help me know where I am. It's really another way to help you read your knitting. This hat has 8 sections of decreases, so you could put a stitch marker at the end of each repeat. That way you know when you get to a marker, that's where the decrease goes. The first rows of decreases alternate between a plain row and a decrease row. So how do you tell whether you just completed a decrease row and it's time for a plain row or vice versa? Now the pattern has checkboxes, so you can check off the rows as you go, but here's a good way to tell if you have just decreased in the last row. Each stitch will have its little V-neck around it, so in between the loops on the needle you will see 2 strands of yarn, one for each V on either side. But if you decreased in the last row, that last stitch before the marker should have 3 strands between it and the stitch before it. This is because you combined 2 stitches into one when you decreased, so 2 stitches are hanging on that last stitch. If you see 3 strands, you know you just decreased in the last row. So here at this spot, we can see that there are 3 strands between the 2 stitches. So this will be a plain row that we're knitting right now. When your knitting is too tight on the circular needle, you need to switch to double pointed needles. My tip here is to use 5 needles if you have that many. Your hat has 8 decreases, so you can put 2 decrease sections on each needle and have your 5th needle as the one you are knitting with. I leave my stitch markers between the sets on each needle. I'll use any trick to help me keep track of where I am. The other stitch markers you don't need anymore because the end of your needle will signal to you that it is time to decrease. Plus, they're at the end of the needle and won't stay on anyway. When you have all of your decreases done, cut your yarn, leaving about a 12-inch tail. Thread the yarn through the stitches in the same direction you have been knitting. If you go the other way, your stitches will unravel. Pull tight, then weave in your ends. For the top, I like to go through a few of the final stitches again, then weave a V shape of 6 to 8 stitches on the inside. For the brim, you'll see there's a little stitch that looks like a knot. This is the slip knot from your cast on, and I like to weave right through that knot first to close up the gap you see there. Then I weave up and back on one of the ribs of the ribbing. The only thing left to do now is block your hat. If you haven't blocked your knits before, do it. You'll be surprised at how much better your stitches look after a good blocking. Check out my How to Block a Hat video for thorough instructions. And there you go, the Maple Ridge hat. I hope you've enjoyed learning some tips and tricks to make knitting this hat easier and more enjoyable. If you're on Instagram, be sure to tag hashtag Maple Ridge hat so you can share your awesome project with others. You can follow me on Instagram at Sonica. You can find my patterns on Ravelry as Sonica Salisbury Designs or on Etsy as Sonica Knits. Happy knitting!